家好，我是陈韵竹老师。那我担任钢琴老师的这个客座讲师已经大概6-7年的时间。那今年非常特别，是用这种方式来跟各位同学见面了。希望大家居家学习都还很顺利，然后也很享受这段时间哦。我今天要来讲的是英国的文化与社会，你所不知道的英国。因为我刚好在英国念书了几年的时间，然后呢，希望可以透过用比较轻松或者是比较生活化的方式呢，去让大家了解过去我们在课本上所看到的英国，或者是我们所读到的历史，它是如何去形塑现代这个社会跟现代自己英国社会本身。那英国的确真的是一个非常特别的一个国家哦，它曾经号称日不落帝国。因为它统治了世界上大概有1/4的疆域的这么大的一个范围哦，所以它自己本身它影响了世界非常多的层面。那现在也受到它自己的这个世界的影响，也有很多的这个回馈哦。那大家可以看到我这个背景的部分呢，这是在英国的泰晤士河。那这边是英国国会，还有大笨钟。那如果在沿的这个泰晤士河呢，一直持续走下去，就会看到像这个 London Eye， 就是伦敦眼，然后还有很多的这个市集啊，然后还有在这个 South Bank， 就是他们的南岸，有很多的这个文化艺术的地方，然后还有这个莎士比亚剧院也是在泰晤士河的河边哦，非常的美丽。那希望疫情过后呢，大家有机会可以亲自到英国或到伦敦去走一走。那现在呢，就可以先听我来跟大家说一些故事。那我们之前可能龚琴老师有讲到，不管是大航海时代，或者是一些英国的殖民历史。那我们现在就来看说，这些殖民历史它是如何影响回英国自己本身的社会，然后也带给世界上什么样的影响。像比如说，我们觉得最大影响可能是语言，像我们现在全世界讲人口最多的讲的语言，其实就是像英文啊。然后呢，还有我们整个西化啊，其实所谓的西化呢，其实也是从这个英语系国家我们现在是受美国很深的影响，但是其实北美它也曾经是英国的殖民地，所以它曾经影响世界非常多的层面哦。所以我们今天会透过几个故事呢，来跟大家说明一下这个英国的文化与社会。那首先就从它的殖民历史开始讲起哈，我们会讲到这个大英博物馆，然后带大家用一个不同的角度去看这个大英博物馆，可能会用什么样的角度？是殖民者的角度呢，还是被殖民的角度去来看待它？然后呢，我们也会提到这个英国的这个王室的故事哦，因为其实英国有个很特别的一个文化现象，就是它的阶级其实非常的分明。那我们会透过像 BBC 的研究，然后我们来分析，英国现在还有什么样子的一个阶级存在呢？那讲到阶级呢，它的顶端就是它的这个王室的家族成员哦。最近也是闹得风风雨雨，那他们的王室故事发生了什么样的事情？那我们就举了几个比较特殊的女性哦，我们把它封为这个史上最强祖母、最强的丈母娘，还有最强小三跟最强产妇。那他们发生了什么样的故事？那接下来我们还有邀请到一个这个曾经是英国殖民地一位澳洲土生土长的这个外籍讲师呢，也来分享他是如何看待这个英国殖民，然后还有英国殖民澳洲对澳洲所产生的这个正面啊，或是负面的一些影响哦。我们可以来听他怎么聊这个英国这个国家。那其实我想要先从这个英国的这些殖民历史开始大略的讲起哦。大家如果有读过这个珍·奥斯汀，就是英国非常有名的一个小说家的话呢，大家可能最熟悉的是他有一本书叫做《傲慢与偏见》，但是我们今天要提到他的另外一本书叫做曼斯费尔的庄园。那有一位非常知名的这个后殖民学者叫做爱德华·萨伊德，他曾经在这个《文化与帝国主义》这本书上面提到了这本珍·奥斯汀这本书哦，他就是这个珍·奥斯汀在描 写说，有一个庄园里面有一对贵族的女儿，然后他们整天没事啊，然后就在喝这个非常高贵的英式下午茶聊天。那你会觉得奇怪，在小说里面读的是非常优雅的一个状态，可是呢，英国的天气其实不适合种茶。那为什么英国会有这么这个强烈的这个下午茶的传统呢？据说他们一天要喝9杯茶哦，就是分时段这样子。那会有这样的传统是为什么呢？因为他们殖民了印度。对，这是书里面没有提到的，但是其实它的真实面就是因为英国有了这个东印度公司，然后有了大批的这个殖民地，然后产出的茶叶，那所以呢才能够支撑这位优雅的贵族的这2位女士可以悠闲的坐在这个美丽的庄园喝下午茶，然后谈论他们的亲戚在印度经营这个农场的有趣故事。所以其实英国那时候上流社会呢，他们靠着他们曾经去过没有去过的土地上面的一些大农场，然后支撑他们去过上这个贵族般的生活。那这个是这个爱德华萨伊德他在《文化与帝国》所举的例子。那他就透过这样子的文本的分析，提醒我们也不要忘记这个小说的脉络当中，正是因为英国它殖民了印度，殖民了其他地方，那它搜刮了很多的资源，才可以支撑这个帝国如此的强盛。那后来的这个贵族呢，也这个开始没落。那我们待会会讲到为什么会没落的原因哦。但是我就用这个小小的这个文学上面的例子，然后来开启我们今天这个英国文化与社会的讲堂。那希望大家都能够享受这堂课。那我们接下来会用录音跟这个外籍老师录影的方式，然后来完成这堂课。那期待之后可以跟大家是在课堂上相见咯。
Hi guys, my name's Arthur and I'm from Australia, and I'll be answering some questions about British colonization. So one common and negative thing about colonization in general is the destructive aspect to the indigenous populations. And in Australia there was widespread destruction of the indigenous culture with the British colonization. So there were many massacres, there was the dispossession of land, and also what we called the stolen generation, where children were taken from the local communities and tried to be brought up, as white. So they essentially tried to breed them out. So we've had a lot of loss of the language and the stories and also the cultural sites in Australia. So that's been one extremely bad aspect of the colonization. One positive is that the Western country that it became after the colonization process is one that's very nice to live in, and I was very lucky to be born in Australia and grow up there, because there's many opportunities and a good standard of life if you're able to live there. One positive thing was that the colonization happened quite recently. Most of the cities and infrastructure was built during the 1800s. So it was a very kind of fresh and modern country that was built from scratch, essentially. I love the design of a lot of the Victorian era architecture. So a lot of the public buildings and the terrace houses that you see in a lot of the cities look really nice. And there's also a culture of, setting up very rational rules and regulations for everything. And I think that's also because, like I said, the country was sort of built from the ground up using all the British systems that had already been established. But it can also mean that people get very angry when you don't follow the rules as well. And if you come to Australia, you can see that in the traffic. If you cross at a red light, people get very angry at you. We were very lucky in that we have lots of natural resources in Australia, and this allows all those public systems and everything to be very well funded. So we've got a kind of a well-running, modern British system because of the time that the British colonization happened and the natural resources and things like that. Our sporting culture is also very British. Cricket, soccer, or football as they call it, tennis, they're all very popular sports in Australia. A lot of people love them and enjoy playing them and going to see professional matches. And even with our own sport, like Australian football, there's a very British culture, I think, of enjoying and playing that sport. Rugby as well is very popular in Australia. So yeah, I think our sporting culture is very British. Obviously, that's a bad thing for some people who don't enjoy sport or sporting culture, but for a lot of people, it's a really good thing. Our drinking culture is also very British. Again, for some people, a bad thing, but a lot of people enjoy it. Drinking lots of beer essentially is what that is, and having lots of nice options for pubs and bars and places to drink. So that's another thing we've inherited. Our food is also very British. So all the classic food that you find in Australia, like the traditional food, is all British food, which we sort of inherited. Like I said, the indigenous cultures and their food was sort of, largely wiped out. So the traditional Australian food that people think of is all the British food that came after. I'd say our sense of humour is also very British. It's hard to describe it exactly, but if you watch British comedies, you can get an idea of it. It's quite dry and can be sarcastic and quite brutal, and with a lot of swear words as well. I think that's just in general. Australians swear a lot, and you can hear that in British culture as well. A lot of swear words get used, but they don't really mean anything bad. So that can be a fun part of the culture, or a bad part as well, depending on your point of view. One negative thing is that there's definitely some white supremacist and racist undercurrent in Australia, which pretty much it existed since it became the one country. And I think you can see similar kinds of racism in the UK and also in America, where it gets tied to a sense of national identity, which is white. And with the British colonization, a lot of the people that sort of founded Australia as that sort of British nation wanted it to remain white. So they wanted to keep it, people just from white European descent as the citizens. So there's lots of opposition to different immigrant groups who wanted to come to Australia, and obviously to the indigenous people as well. And I think up until the 1960s, we had policies that stopped a lot of immigrant groups from coming in and becoming citizens. So that's definitely one negative aspect, which was related to the British colonization and associating Australia as a British nation and a white nation as well. So New Zealand did have a referendum to change their flag a few years ago. They're part of the Commonwealth like Australia, which means we used to be part of the British Empire. Being part of the Commonwealth doesn't really mean anything now, but it's just a reminder of the history. And New Zealand also has the Union Jack, the British flag, on their flag, like Australia does. So they had a referendum, which was held by a Conservative Prime Minister, which is interesting, to change the design of the flag, potentially. And so what happened was, a system was set up where people from the public, created designs and posted them, and they got voted on. And I think the top 5 designs, made it to the final. And the most popular one of those got put to a vote against the original flag. And I think the original flag ended up winning by like a few percent in the end. I think it was a bit of an interesting process because there wasn't really a big public demand to change the flag at the time. It was a little bit random. And so a lot of people saw it as a waste of time afterwards. But in New Zealand and also in Australia, there's lots of people who don't like the fact that the British flag is still on the flag, because it's a reminder that we're not considered an independent country is one thing. And the other thing is that, it can be quite insensitive to the indigenous populations that still exist, because, the British Empire and their colonial expansion is what, caused them to be wiped out, physically, and also their culture as well. So I think if you look at the statistics, it was mainly, well, not mainly, but the Maori people, who are the indigenous people in New Zealand, voted a lot more heavily in favor of the new design. And the new design, I think, had the New Zealand silver fern, which is like one of their natural plants, had like a design of the leaf of that plant instead of the British flag. So it was something that was a bit more like authentic or indigenous to New Zealand as a place, and not the British Empire. I have been to the UK, but only very briefly, and just to London for about 2 weeks altogether. So my impression just from London was that it was very busy, very big, and very expensive. But it's quite an international city, so I couldn't say that I got like a traditional UK experience just from being in London. I think if I went to some of the more, quiet towns and other areas of England and, Scotland as well, you get more of a traditional experience of what the UK, was and still is. But yeah, my experience was pretty limited, and yeah, was just in London. So one thing that impresses me, and I think I've touched on it before, is I like a lot of the neoclassical architecture that's used for the public buildings and a lot of the large-scale architecture in London and also other parts of the UK. Stonehenge as well is a great bit of ancient architecture in the UK. I love the pub food, all those types of food that became like traditional food in Australia, like fish and chips, the big English breakfast, meat pies, they're all great. Beer as well, the culture of drinking beer, I enjoy a lot. Not so much now, but definitely for quite a few years in Australia, I enjoyed drinking lots of beer. So that's one thing definitely. And like I said before, I think the sporting culture and the kind of attitude to sport can be a really fun thing. And I definitely enjoy sport. I enjoyed it growing up and playing it as well. And I think like the atmosphere at the Premier League football matches in the UK is something that's just really great. If it doesn't get violent, then it's really fun, I think. But some people also enjoy that. So yeah, that's something that we have in Australia and that I really enjoy in the UK.